Hello class, and welcome to our reading review video of pages 75 to 78 in Writing Logically, Thinking Critically. And I feel as though these pages directly relate to the intro paragraph for Essay 2 and for essays that you will be writing in the future. Right off the bat, our first term on page 75 is rhetoric. And the following definition from Aristotle provides the most useful approach for our purposes. At the top of 76, the book defines it as the art of using language to good effect, to prove, to convince, to persuade. And that's essentially what we do in this class, whether you're writing a rhetorical précis, right? A précis is a 4-sentence summary. Add that adjective rhetorical, right? A précis, which you analyze how something persuades or convinces through the art of using language. So again, rhetoric, the noun, the art of using language to good effect, to prove, to convince, or to persuade. So the essays that we read are good examples of rhetoric, and hopefully you can emulate those essays when you're creating your own. So, as it tells us on page 76, the introduction, there's 4 things to consider. I think that number 1, beginning with a narrative or an anecdote and invoking your ethos. So for essay 1 on the story of an hour, right, you might have written about the theme of love or marriage or happiness or relationships or identity, and you might have invoked your ethos. Are you in a relationship? What's your identity? Are you a woman? Are you married? Are you a husband? Are you a wife? Things of that nature, right? So number 1, right, beginning with a relevant narrative, part of the background to capture the reader's interest, right? Give background on your subject and topic. So essentially, you might give a little bit of background on your own relation to the theme or on your own experience reading the poem. Before you read the poem, what'd you think about that theme or idea, that issue? After you read the poem, what'd you think? You might begin with a little biographical information, a narrative about the author, or a narrative about the setting and milieu of the poem. So I think that the strategies on page 76 are important ones to consider when constructing your intro paragraph, not just for essay 2, but for all the essays that you write. So the second thing it suggests is that you should bring an applicable quotation to provide an interesting way into your argument. For essay 1, as we discussed, everybody should have quoted either the last sentence of the story or part of that idea of that she died of heart disease, of joy that kills, and then your thesis should have developed your answer to the prompt, does Louise die of joy? So what I always suggest when analyzing literature, right, consider the title, consider the first lines, consider the last lines. So ideally, you should include the poem's title, obviously, in your intro, but maybe consider the last lines of the poem or a particular line or group of lines that you found extremely important that can add interest to your intro paragraph when you quote those lines. Maybe quote the last lines of the poem like you quoted the last lines of the story for essay 1. 3, you could begin with contrast, right? And 4, you might begin with an explanation of the topic. So you might explain what an explication essay is. You might quote or cite from reading and writing about literature. You might look at your theme or your perspective from the opposite of what the poem says to lead in. So if the poem makes a point about love, you might start by describing the contrasting ideas about love to lead into the point the poem makes about love. So I think the 4 strategies on 76 are very helpful as you're drafting your introduction, and make sure you have background on your issue, right? The theme or themes you're going to focus on. The question at issue, right? What do we learn about your theme or themes by analyzing your poem? So make sure you give some background on the poem, right? Then answer that question at issue in the thesis, right? And then make sure that you list out those elements of fiction, elements of poetry that you're going to focus on in the body paragraphs as you analyze the poem. Uh, the last thing I want to touch on is this idea of the confirmation of your position, right? It says, called in classical rhetoric, the confirmation of your position. This support should be connected explicitly to your thesis. When we write about literature, sorry, I wanted to get my book so I could show it. When we write about literature, if it's a story, we focus on the elements of fiction. If it's a poem, we focus on the elements of fiction and the elements of poetry. So the confirmation of your position is going to be that sentence or the sentences within your intro that list out your elements of fiction or your elements of poetry that you're going to focus on to prove your thesis. Those are your premises. You should have multiple premises. I suggest at least three. Elements of fiction is a good way to get started. Um, so, that being said, hopefully you found this video helpful, and stay tuned because more to come, specifically pages 78 to 82, in which we'll focus on constructing the draft and incorporating those rhetorical strategies the book suggests into Essay 2. Stay tuned, more to come, and as always, get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you for your patience.